Hi, my name's Tim. This video attempts to provide a broad overview of a number of different elements and models entailed in second language acquisition. It's an attempt to present many of the constructs that are covered by an Introduction to Second Language Acquisition course in a single tableau so that students can visualize and relativize these ideas. I confess that the entire video essentially ignores the whole sociocultural approach, though not because I discount it. I just didn't have any way of fitting it in. Also, another disclaimer, this video is quite simplistic in an attempt to help students of SLA derive an emergent understanding of the field. So, as said, I'll be presenting a number of different models and theories that are implicated in the field of second language acquisition. We'll just start with a couple of basics. What we have here is a basic model of second language acquisition. This one was described by Susan Gass, and it entails input, that is to say the language that learners are exposed to in their environment. Intake, which is the actual language that they internalize to build the language system. The language system itself, which we call interlanguage. And output, which is the language that learners produce, and that production is supported by the interlanguage. So we'll start with the input hypothesis. The input hypothesis was propounded by Stephen Krashen, who observed that only language structures that are comprehensible to the learner at any given moment are candidates for acquisition. If we consider a language structure in context, like some kind of negative such as I don't like apples, the learner has to make meaning of the morphemes don't, as well as perceive its phonological form, the d, o, and t sounds, in order to have the potential to store it as a newly acquired linguistic feature. There is some debate currently as to the extent of total comprehension for this in order to take place. There may only need to be partial comprehension or imperfect comprehension, but nonetheless some kind of comprehension in order for a learner to store a new form. Intake is a subset of input. In other words, learners cannot intake everything they hear. Instead, learners' language systems are selective, not consciously selective per se, about what can be acquired at any given time. And this is often linked to the stage of learner development and their capacity for directing attention to new linguistic forms. The interlanguage is a term coined by Larry Selinker in 1972. It is the emergent linguistic system that a learner constructs, or as Susan Gass has said it, learners impose structure on the linguistic evidence that they hear in the input, and the resulting structure that they've imposed is the interlanguage. It has been described as containing structures from the L1, structures from the L2 that are target-like, and structures that are not forcibly L1 or L2-like. These are hypotheses that learners have about the language, or non-target-like mappings of a language form and a language and a meaning. It recognizes that language is also made up of multiple subsystems and that these domains are subject to processes of transfer from first language, for example, or fossilization, that is to say the cessation of development. Looking at output, we consider the output hypothesis. The output hypothesis has been advanced by Merrill Swain, and the premise of the output hypothesis is that while indeed comprehensible input is a requisite of language acquisition, output also plays an important role in structure building, because through output, learners try out their hypotheses of how a language works, and their attention is raised as to how well the meanings they intend to communicate actually match the linguistic inventory that they have. And so output creates conditions of feedback, which also raises their attention. Feedback can come to a learner in numerous forms. There's negative feedback, which entails a clear indication to the learner that they have in some way said something wrong. An example of feedback in this way would be an overt correction, and that would be considered negative feedback. Equally, there is feedback that can be indicated to a learner that they've actually produced something correctly. That is to say, the learners interpreted it as such, even though it may not be true. And one of the problems that we see with feedback is whether learners actually interpret the feedback in the way that it was intended and in a way that will appropriately maintain or change their interlanguage. The interaction hypothesis is a hypothesis that was advanced by Michael Long, which essentially says that when a learner undergoes cycles of input processing and output processing and undergoes feedback and makes interactional moves with another speaker to refine their message, and as he terms it, negotiation of meaning, then the interlanguage is likely to develop. He maintains that the primary context in which this happens must be a meaning-driven environment with occasional focus on linguistic form, that is to say, occasional focus on the grammatical well-formedness of what is said. And his focus on form's distinction really touches on this. It's a pedagogical approach that states that teachers should not teach via a grammatical syllabus, especially one of decontextualized practice, which he calls focus on forms with an S. Instead, learners should be subjected to a genuinely communicative environment with primary interest in communicating meanings, and only occasionally shifting one's attention to a focus on how the intended meanings are encoded to linguistic forms. And it's this occasional shift from meaning-driven context to a focus on grammaticality and grammatical well-formedness that underlies the focus on form approach. One of the important things that happens is that during negotiations of meaning, the learner's attentional capacity is raised, and with attention being raised in the context of meaningful communication, we see more likelihood, or we're supposed to see more likelihood of language acquisition. So you'll see that there's a value on the construct of attention in language acquisition. Attention has been recognized that, or recognizes that learner consciousness at some basic level, that a directed attention is likely necessary for acquisition at some point, because learners have to notice a difference between what is in their interlanguage and the meanings that they intend to produce for output, or how particular forms in the input are uninterpretable. Richard Schmidt and Peter Robinson have written extensively on the topic, and they recognize that attention is a limited capacity faculty that is constrained by a learner's particular stage of development and also individual differences. So this is to say that less proficient learners, their attentional capacities are being burdened by a certain level of linguistic stimuli in the environment, whereas more proficient learners, their attention is more efficient for processing basic elements of the linguistic environment, and are now moving on to more advanced things. So using this notion of learner development as a constraint on attention, we also look at another way that this is expressed through a thing called processability theory by Pieneman, who attempts to characterize stages of learner development. Basically, he states that learners' ability to process linguistic features is contingent upon the stage of development of the learner. And at their most basic, a learner has a very limited lexicon in the initial stages and relies heavily on another speaker or on the context. That is to say that a learner might point a lot in order to get their message across. Gradually, a learner, as they move upwards through the stages, will grow their lexicon, and they are able to start acquiring and attaching grammatical morphemes of different types over time. It's important to note that much of this theory, the processability theory, is focused on output, and it relies on Levelt's speech processing model for a number of its procedural claims. It also has a different view of grammar called lexical functional grammar. That is to say that the way that language structures are represented in the interlanguage is specified in a different way in lexical functional grammar than it would be with, for example, UG rules, or it is perhaps in some way more aligned with constructions and usage-based theories. So it's also important to note that there are other claims about developmental stages. There are a number of authors out there who have described them. So talking about the speech processing, William Levelt and others have been working on a speech production model, which basically says that in order to formulate output, a learner's language system performs several tiers of operation, starting from conceptualization of the ideas behind the utterances, and then the selection of lexicon that will be used to articulate those ideas, and then those lexical items are assembled syntactically, and then there are morphological add-ons, all of which ultimately tap into the articulating processes, that is to say getting your vocal cords to vibrate in synchrony with jaw and tongue movement, for example. And of course this is one of several speech production or speech processing models. So moving away from output processing, we now look to input processing. And as with output processing, input processing entails multiple steps. Perhaps the most prominent theorist is Bill Van Patten, who says that regardless of how you frame the interlanguage as something that is made up of universal grammar, which I'll describe shortly, or usage-based constructions, also to be described shortly, we as humans are endowed with a perceptual system, a way of directing our attentional capacity towards linguistic information in the input so as to strategically derive meaning. So our brain basically has these input processes that are used as strategies for interpreting the input and extracting meaning. Okay? And so he calls this input processing. His research suggests that humans universally, when learning a second language, will at some stage of development rely on these innate information processing principles in order to comprehend the input. And these processing principles include, for example, that one is likely to process lexical items for meaning before processing grammatical features, that one is likely to process non-redundant grammatical features as opposed to redundant grammatical features. And by redundancy, I mean if a grammatical feature expresses the future and no other item in the sentence, like the word tomorrow, expresses the future, then the learner will process that grammatical feature. Another processing principle would be the first noun principle. That is to say that a learner who encounters the first noun in a sentence is likely to interpret it as the subject of the sentence, even though some languages don't forcibly work that way all the time. One additional component of input processing is this thing called the parser, which is a feature of our mind and our language processing that segments the linguistic information coming in through the input and determines whether the sounds that it hears are nouns and which ones are verbs, and how they fit the subject and verb roles in a sentence. And it's basically syntactic processing is what goes on in this scheme. Also on the input processing side of things, Michael Sharwood Smith has advanced a rather important distinction. He says that there are two ways of processing input. One is for the purposes of comprehension, and one is for the purposes of actually changing the language, the interlanguage, that is to say acquisition. Not all comprehensible input is processed for intake. It gets as far as comprehension, and the learner's meanings, the communication requirements are satisfied for the time, and there doesn't seem to be any further development of the interlanguage despite comprehension. Okay. This idea bumps up against usage-based theories that say that all language use will have some kind of impact on the language system, even if it is maintaining the status quo and entrenching neural activation patterns more deeply. So a usage-based theorist would look at this and say, okay, yes, comprehension did take place, and therefore it is going to, because the neural pathways have been activated in a regular pattern that might have been done so before, we are just going to more deeply entrench those neural pathways as likely to fire again. Okay, we'll move on to universal grammar. So I'll just clear the decks a little bit just to help us focus our attention. Okay, universal grammar is one of two rather broad and important theories of language acquisition. It's certainly one of the older of the two. It's described as an innate endowment of linguistic rules that we're all born with. And while 40 plus years of research have attempted to describe many aspects of SLA in terms of this innate endowment, there's always been this recurrent question: why is it that L2 learners do not seem to have access to the same posited universal grammar that helped them learn their L1 so powerfully, despite the fact that there weren't any great models in the language environment? Universal grammarists rely on the poverty of stimulus argument quite a lot. It says that our language environment, while highly communicative, does not provide us with consistently with enough good models of language for our system to use, because, as you probably heard in my video, there's lots of slips of the tongue and false starts. Therefore, the learning conditions are not great. Consequently, we must possess an innate endowment that helps us learn despite these impoverished learning conditions. Many in the field of SLA have said that really the only way that universal grammar affects second language is to broadly constrain the kinds of hypotheses that learners will make. And it's fairly narrowly defined. I mean, universal grammar tends to really just talk about very core aspects of the language faculty. It's not concerned at all with input processing or output processing. They are of secondary or even tertiary interests to universal grammarists. These folks are interested in the idealized language system that's going on. And furthermore, they also define language rather narrowly, that there are slots for words to go in, and there are rules for combining those words or organizing those slots. And furthermore, there are rules for movement, like WH movement, moving the WH word like who, what, where, when to the front of an underlying sentence to make it a question. Island constraints. And part of the problem is that, as I've said, universal grammar is very narrowly defined, or its realm of consideration is very narrowly defined. It does not entertain many aspects of the lexicon as part of language, and it's really just concerned with basic rules of recombination. And furthermore, there's another strong tendency to claim that the linguistic knowledge that governs universal grammar is actually unique and discrete from all other aspects of human knowledge. That is to say that it is domain specific or specific to the language domain. One of the competing theories set of theories is called usage-based theories, and usage-based theorists have rejected many of the claims of universal grammar and have sought to describe many of the language learner phenomena in other terms, like why learners fossilize, why they have the types of errors they do. One major difference is that between UG and UB is that learners are not born with an innate linguistic structure in the UB framework. They don't have grammatical templates. Instead, learners build structure in their minds through language use, when domain general learning mechanisms like associative learning, chunking, comparison, and categorization, as well as sensitivity to frequency, in which a linguistic, that is to say the frequency with which a linguistic feature occurs, and how regularly that linguistic feature co-occurs perhaps with some other linguistic feature. For example, the word budge as a verb tends to almost always be used with the negative construction. He won't budge, it won't budge, they wouldn't budge. Okay. Equally, for example, like an S at the ends of words can sometimes indicate a plural, but not always. So, another important aspect of usage-based theories is that the linguistic unit of acquisition is not a rule like UG would hold. Instead, they would say it is a construction, that is to say, a mapping of meaning to some phonological form. So, looking at mapping, this is a process of associating a set of sounds to a meaning and a context of use. It is the process of forming a construction. When learners acquire new mappings of a meaning they wish to communicate to a phonological form, so they've got an idea and they got to figure out how to say it, and they find a new set of sounds that are going to communicate that meaning. They actually often seem to do so in what's called a one-to-one principle, which Anderson and Bardovey-Harlick would observe. For example, a learner may use the word will exclusively to indicate future meaning, to the exclusion of the phrase going to at first. But gradually, learners acquire multiple ways of expressing a concept in a new language, and they move towards many-to-one form meaning mappings. When you apply a functional analysis of learner data, you are interested in seeing how learners have mapped certain meanings. So you're really looking at the inventory of the interlanguage. It's worth mentioning, however, that functionalists, or the functionalist view, makes no claims of the actual processes that take place in the interlanguage. They're merely concerned with identifying the inventory of features. Another important idea or set of ideas that align well with usage-based theories is this notion of input properties. And the role that those input properties play in shaping how a learner constructs an interlanguage. So, for example, usage-based theories say that the brain is sensitive to how frequently something occurs in the environment. And that sensitivity to frequency, when it meets up with something that happens frequently in the input, is a determinant of how the interlanguage is going to structure itself. Therefore, researchers have looked at the effects of frequency and how some linguistic features, like the word the, is more frequent than others. Okay? And they talk about things like Zipfian distribution. That is to say that there seems to be a universal curve in much of the natural world and in human behavior of frequency patterns that fall along a similar type of curve, not exactly a bell curve, but a similar kind of idea. Since learners are exposed to these distributions, their language structure and their language processing reflects internally the way that the input comes at them externally. And because the interlanguage is a self-organizing entity, according to usage-based folks, and it self-organizes in relation to how input properties and patterns of output take place. It organizes itself to work most efficiently. It's always sort of seeking to adjust itself for optimal performance in deriving the most meaning from a situation, and that's called rational tuning. Other features of input include contingencies. That is to say, how likely one linguistic form is going to occur with another linguistic form, or how likely a particular meaning is going to be associated with a particular sound. I gave the plural, or I gave the S sound at the end of words as an example of having an unpredictable contingency. Okay. Patterns and recency are, that is to say, how recently something occurred in the input, are also determinants of how the interlanguage will organize itself. Building once again on this idea of input properties and its relationship to the interlanguage, there's also this notion of learnability. And learnability is kind of a loaded term because universal grammarians use this in a particular way, and I'm not going to be using it in exactly the same way as the UG people. So if the input is frequent and noticeable, for example, perhaps because a part of the input receives syllable stress, or because meaning is readily interpretable from the environment when a form is heard, like look, a dog, and there's somebody pointing to a dog, and the listener hears the word dog and sees the image of the dog in front of them. That makes something very learnable. Or when forms and meanings consistently align, or locations align. So the word the always occurs before nouns, which is great. But unfortunately, in that same slot, you have a whole variety of other forms that also turn up in that same slot. Or items that are related are spread across different parts of the sentence. So the present progressive, I am going, the am and the ing at the end of the verb are working together, but they're not in the exact same location in the sentence. And so these things create barriers or ways forward for learnability. And learnability is determined partly due to our the limitations of our innate processing and learning mechanisms. So these learning mechanisms are innate, and attention is also innate, and parsing is just something that is innate as well. And these processing principles are innate, and they are not actual language structure themselves, but they are ways in which that the human mind interfaces with the language structure on the outside and assembles it or helps to generate language structure internally. Moving on to another idea that once again piggybacks on these ideas of learnability and input properties, we have what's called the selective fossilization hypothesis by Xiaohong Han. Okay, and what it does is it builds on this idea of input properties and learnability that I've just described, but it also ties in this notion of a learner's first language and how all of these elements conspire to predict whether a particular linguistic feature is more or less likely to fossilize for a particular learner. All right, moving on to another set of ideas. We look at Robert de Keyser's work on skill acquisition theory. And you'll notice that there's just two little minimal points here. Basically, the idea is this, that skill acquisition theory applies to all aspects of a human skill development, whether it be learning how to chop things with a knife in a cooking environment, to linguistic behavior, to literally riding a bicycle and driving. But in the language domain, what we see is a gradual change in how language features are processed for input. So that is to say that this stretch of operations happening here, or this stretch of operations happening for output, And what we see is that there is a streamlining, or there is an improvement in the information handling through these channels, here and here. So they become lightning fast. Okay. There's a shift in reliance on a rather fast mapping but slow performing declarative knowledge system towards a proceduralized and ultimately automatized processing. So what you see in this pictorial representation is input processing as far as comprehension, not forcibly rapid acquisition per se, but at least processing to the point of comprehension, and processing to the point of forming output, or through the point of forming output, becomes streamlined over time. The language system, which includes the interlanguage store of language structure, for input decoding and output decoding, also becomes more streamlined. So the way that this language store is accessed in order to build comprehension, not forcibly to change the interlanguage, but in order to arrive at comprehension, the learner has to appeal to their knowledge store, and access to this knowledge store becomes more and more rapid and automatic over time. And finally, we have complexity theory. And I'll just highlight all of these things. Okay, and all I've done is added a few lines, but basically we have complexity theory, which has been advanced by Diane Larson Freeman. And she too is an importer of ideas from outside the field of linguistics, in the same way as skill acquisition theory and a number of usage-based theories as well. But basically it's a way of understanding the whole bowl of spaghetti. Dynamic systems and complexity theory in particular has been used to describe phenomena in physics and also in biological systems. Also, the ideas that circulate in complexity theory seem to work well with usage-based theories. You could even consider complexity theory as a subset, if you will, of, or coming under the umbrella of usage-based theories. Okay? But it really accentuates or focuses on the actual dynamics of how usage-based theories take place. Okay? That is to say that it looks at interactions between structures. How are the L1, the L2, and learner hypotheses interacting with one another? And how the relative inventories are going to be different for each learner, and therefore the interactions that take place between them are going to be unique to each learner. Okay? And how attentional capacities are subject to individual differences, and how that is going to affect the entire system. So it really takes into account multiple areas of dynamics and multiple factors. And it accentuates, like I say, interactions between structures at different levels of language processing, and perceptual systems like attention and such, working memory. And it talks about things in terms of how things emerge in different timelines, okay, and that they emerge in a non-linear fashion, as we've seen U-shaped learning as one example of that. And how that the language system is dynamic, and that it's adaptive to conditions of language use, very much along the lines of the rational tuning that I mentioned before in usage-based theories. It observes, it's able to account for the fact that everybody experiences language differently. So while universal grammarians have been interested in that which is universal to everybody, and really talking about that exclusively, complexity theory is able to articulate where differences come from. How, for example, people are exposed to different patterns of input, and they produce different patterns of output based on the meanings that are important for their own individual experiences. And so in a way, complexity theory is able to reflect both regularities that occur in language development, but also individuation within the systems. So I hope you found this useful. I've tried to incorporate as much as I possibly can and keep it cohesive, and hopefully show you where many of these constructs sit relative to one another. Anyway, thank you very much.